Deepcool went heavy with its marketing for the Assassin 3 cooler when it was first shown at CES 2019 and continued pushing hard with marketing throughout the year. A lot of the early messages persist even now, and it all leaned heavily on bragging about a heat pipe design that uses both sintered powder and grooved inner walls. Deepcool's marketing insisted somewhat vaguely that, quote, its grooved-sintered technology is 15% faster in heat conduction. Of course, this is already sort of misleading marketing for other reasons, but it has been a major coverage point throughout the life of the product. Deepcool's own Amazon UK page still says that it has, quote, 7 high-tech heat pipes with, quote, grooved-sintered technology, significantly increasing the inner surface of the heat pipes for unmatched level of heat transfer. Well, we cut one of those heat pipes open, and it isn't grooved. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2080 Ti XC Ultra. The 2080 Ti XC Ultra is what we use in our CPU reviews to avoid GPU bottlenecks. The XC Ultra uses hydraulic dynamic bearing fans for reduced noise, features RTX support for DXR titles, and uses a massive 2.75 slot cooler. The cooler design allows the fans to spin slower and quieter while sinking heat, further leveraging a mix of L-shaped and traditional fins to maximize airflow or contact. Learn more at the link in the description below. The heat pipes on the Assassin that we cut open we have 2 of them first of all, and they're just sintered. Like basically every other CPU or GPU cooler on the market. Most coolers these days use sintered copper powder inside of their heat pipes. And we've since reached out to Deepcool. We have received a public statement that we've got in this video about why they made that change. But we've also more aggressively tested some of the other marketing claims that Deepcool had for this product following the lack of its key marketing point, including the spoiler, for example. The thing on the top of this cooler, Deepcool calls this plastic appendage a spoiler and says that it helps with flow guidance, which it certainly helped with downforce in a corner if it were on a racetrack. But as far as flow guidance and how that might realistically impact performance in a meaningful way for computers, that gets a bit more nebulous, so we've tested that as well. This difference in the heat pipe execution versus marketing is something that we discovered in coverage before CES 2020, but we were not focusing on the cooler for that coverage. We mentioned it, and then we temporarily moved on and pinged Deepcool and said, what's going on here? So to recap things, if you missed it, we cut open several heat pipes from different types of coolers. We have footage of all that, and we demonstrated how they're manufactured. We've already detailed heat pipe manufacturing in a great amount of depth in a separate video, but that particular content that we did for the Deepcool heat pipes talked about how heat pipes work relative to gravity, because a lot of people ask, well, does it matter if it's this way or this way? And so that's what we tested in that content. But none of that's important here. We knew that Deepcool had marketed its Assassin 3 as having grooved sintered heat pipes. This is also known as composite. It's not new, it's not special, but it is kind of rare. So it is a worthy marketing point if you actually have it and you aren't making it up. And we also knew at the time that a lot of the reviews talked about this sintered grooved heat pipe feature as a major selling point. So when we cut one open and found that it was only sintered after gently flaking off some of the powder on the inner walls, we didn't use any tools because we didn't want to accidentally scrape in a groove and trick ourselves. So you just flake it off with a fingernail and see that it's just completely flat. Deepcool did confirm our findings when we asked them, is this expected or is this a one-off defect? And they said that's how it's really made. So they were definitely only sintered. Before getting into the topic of marketing lies versus mistakes and manufacturing problems, we should probably briefly explain why any of this matters from the standpoint of just a cooling product without even looking at the marketing BS that is tied to this particular cooling product. Because again, most of the reviews and the retail pages and user comments, everything, including our CES 2019 coverage, was focused on this composite heat pipe feature. And all of that was wrong, it appears. So that's all to the fault of Deepcool. But to detail why any of this matters, from a technological standpoint, these aren't new, but they're expensive. And economies of scale compound that, because fewer people order the heat pipes because they're expensive. That means the price goes up. And machine time costs a lot as well. You're adding a step to the process to add the grooves into the heat pipe. That adds a lot of machine time for each pipe. They have to charge for that machine time because you can instead make more of the sintered copper powder pipes instead of fewer of the composite pipes. So that cost has to be made up somewhere by the factory. We're not going to recap how heat pipes work start to finish again. We've done that several times, most recently in our inverted orientation testing, where we demonstrated how capillary action does all the cooling, not gravity. So we'll just link that content in the description if you want a primer on how it works and some of our animations on it. Specifically for Deepcool's marketing, saying the basics are that sintered powder is used inside of the heat pipes for a few reasons. The first is that it helps with capillary action. This is true for just all heat pipes in general, and guidance of the steam as it leaves the evaporator and approaches the condenser of the vacuum-sealed copper tube. This is also why heat pipes are used in applications like satellites, where you have to rely on a phase change to get things to move around. The second reason is that it increases the surface area of the copper to spread heat, particularly into the area where droplets come back down or where the vapor goes up. Going with grooves and sinters theoretically furthers the maximum surface area that could potentially have some knock-on effects that improve cooling performance as well. We need to talk about this 15% number that's attached to the composite approach as well. 15% is not a temperature delta. They're not saying that it's 15% cooler, and I'm going to explain why that's flawed in a moment, than with just a sintered copper pipe in the same heatsink. What they're saying, somewhat nebulously, is that it is either 15% better heat transfer conduction for a single heat pipe, or maybe 15% better with all of them collectively, and I think there are 7 on here. So that's what they're saying. That does not mean the entire cooler is 15% better in what it's doing. It just means that aspect of the cooler is 15% better. As a counterpoint, or a similar point, when Corsair talked about one of its new power supplies a couple years ago that had this upgraded PFC in it, they said that that was something like 98% efficient, but that didn't mean the entire power supply was. It meant that single component was 98% efficient, and that component might be dealing with a couple watts or whatever it was at the time. So it's similar to that. We're talking about one aspect of the entire product. Now, as far as the percentages with temperature, I did want to bring this up because this is a problem I've seen in coverage of products like this, but temperature change, you shouldn't really compare with percentages because it's on an arbitrary scale. So I've written down an example here. If you have, for example, 15% better difference in Kelvin as opposed to 15% better performance in degrees Celsius, those are going to be different numbers. So going from 50 degrees Celsius, or let's say you go from 100 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, that is not a 50% reduction in temperature, and going from 50 to 100 is not a 100% increase in temperature. So if you converted these numbers to Kelvin, which of course would be the same amount of energy, the actual unit we're talking about, but with a different scale, then you end up with a completely different percentage for the same change. You'd be going from 373.15 Kelvin to 323.15 Kelvin instead of 100 to 50. And that, if you just do the numbers, is a 15.5% reduction, we'll call it. So you really shouldn't use percentages for an arbitrary scale. Just wanted to clear that up. It doesn't work. The numbers come out differently. Just talking pure raw numbers, leave it there. There's no confusion that way. And it's always going to be either confusing or wrong. And those are your two options depending on how you do it, depending on the context. So this should be evidenced by the fact that the percentage changes based on the scale that you're using. Anyway, all that out of the way, what Deepcool really meant here was the individual heat pipe, but they also didn't actually follow through with doing a composite anyway. So it would be fair in product marketing to say it's 15% better if it were true, but it's not. So what is happening here is Deepcool lied and said that the product has grooves and sintered heat pipes when it doesn't. That wouldn't matter if Deepcool never marketed that it has composite heat pipes, but it did. And so now it matters. And that's just the way marketing works here. So as far as Deepcool's response, our email went out to Deepcool pretty quickly after discovery, and the company shot back a reply almost immediately with great urgency and said, quote, "Yes, it's sintered and not grooved. We misunderstood its interior instruction from the very beginning. We confirm that it's just sintered. This point has been corrected from October. Actually, sorry that we didn't make it clear to you earlier, so it's not needed to mention that part. Thanks." Obviously, we're mentioning it. So that's all well and good. We did some looking around. The marketing language isn't actually corrected in a lot of places. It's corrected on the official website, at least in English for the US market. That's corrected. It appears as of now that the Amazon US listing is corrected, but there are a lot of other places like the Amazon UK page and some of the other smaller retails where it seems like it's either just been forgotten or maybe someone else manages those listings and never got the notice. So further, all the news articles, including our original CES report, contain information that makes the coverage largely contingent on this marketing point of a composite heat pipe. So those are all inaccurate now, again, including our initial coverage about that specific feature. Now, a couple things I need to talk about in a moment. That doesn't invalidate reviews. Review data, if it was accurate to begin with, will remain accurate because the review units had the same heat pipes that you're getting in a retail unit. So you don't need to freak out and say all the reviews are wrong. They're not, as long as they were right to begin with. This fact doesn't change that the data would be right if it were originally. So you'd still be good there, and if you're happy with the performance of the cooler, you should still be happy with the performance of the cooler. That doesn't change. Anyway, we got another email after this one without sending a reply even. This was 2 hours later, and Deepcool said, quote, "We initially used the processes of sintered and grooved in our lab, but we found that the performance dispersion is relatively large after massive performance testings. So in order to ensure the stock that are all with stable high performance, we adjusted the sintered process with some internal packing powder, vacuum, and other parameters to achieve the same high performance that we targeted for the product and maintain the stability of each product that we ship to end users. So every piece of the Assassin 3 in the market is just sintered, no one is grooved." To break this down a bit, we think that when Deepcool says it has a high dispersion, probably what the company is referring to is a high variance from unit to unit. That would be our guess, is that perhaps if they actually did get composite heat pipes, they ran a lot of them through tests and found that A versus B, maybe sometimes it is 15% better in whatever metric they're testing, and sometimes it's 0. So that would be a guess. We're not really sure what it'd mean otherwise. It's an odd choice of phrasing, but either way, Deepcool's nameplate did say something that leads us to doubt this explanation. The nameplate at CES 2019 said the following, quote, and this is from a Kit Guru video. I'll give them a shout out for actually pointing their camera at this. It says, quote, "To achieve the most competitive performance, Deepcool computational fluid dynamic engineers took the lead in the whole R&D process of the Assassin 3. Hundreds of simulation verification tests were made before its finalization. Almost every detail of this cooler is tuned for lower wind resistance and higher dissipation efficiency. With a stunning 280-watt TDP, the Assassin 3 is ready to amaze the world." So first of all, claiming that computational fluid dynamics engineers performed, quote, hundreds of tests does lead us to believe that this is a little more than just, oops, there was variance, we didn't expect that, especially given the earlier phrasing of, we misunderstood this from the beginning. So we have a suspicion that Deepcool was perhaps told by its supplier that its heat pipes were sintered and grooved, but they weren't. That would be my guess. They may have ended up with products that were just normal sintered heat pipes and didn't realize it or didn't check. It's speculation, but ultimately we know from experience with manufacturing that initial sampling runs, you normally get 1, 2, maybe 3 shots at something before you start kind of pissing off the factory and they aren't sure if you're serious about the product. So it's possible that that was the situation here. It's possible that Deepcool ended up with a couple samples, maybe 2 of them, before going into MP or mass production. And if that were the case, it's also possible Deepcool might have never dissected one of the heat pipes to check for themselves because maybe they needed the unit for testing. So that could be a potential explanation, but that entire bit there is, again, is my speculation based on experience and some knowledge of how the industry works, but it is speculation nonetheless. So you'd think either way that whether or not Deepcool is being truthful in its explanation, it was still marketed incorrectly. It was mismarketed. Definitely you could call this lying, because you'd think someone would have known before October, which is when the changes went live to Deepcool's official website. We also went through archive.org, checked all of their listings on their own website and retail websites, and confirmed this. So October is where the changes started rolling out. It didn't hit everything, but the reviews went up at the very end of September. And something tells me that perhaps Deepcool knew about this before the first reviews went up, because you're talking a difference of a couple days there. And reviewers were talking about how great the heat pipes are. This isn't to knock reviewers, because most reviewers, often including us, will not do something like cut open a heat pipe. And we just happened to pick this one because we knew it was marketed as composite, and we wanted an example of what that looks like, and that's how we found out. So that's not a knock on reviewers, because ultimately they're looking at performance, and obviously you should validate claims where possible, but it's not always so easy. So it's more of a Deepcool comment. Anyway, speaking of that, the important reminder is that assuming the tests were correct, the marketing lie doesn't change performance in reviews that were accurate. We've seen some pretty bad data out there for cooler reviews recently, but for tests which were conducted correctly, the results would remain largely unchanged because the cooler has already had heat pipe changes in place. This means that if you're happy with the performance and you bought one, you can remain happy with the performance. There's no reason to get mad at your cooler purchase for this. You shouldn't feel remorse for it. It's not really a bait and switch in the same way as maybe taking a product with one power capability for reviewers and shipping with another. So to be very clear, if you bought it and you like it, we don't want you to feel bad about the purchase. This new information doesn't change the performance of the product, but it does change the brand credibility and the trustworthiness of Deepcool's marketing going forward. All of that out of the way, it's probably time to do some testing on this. So we do have a lot of thermal data on the coolers. I need to get around to writing about it and publishing it in a standalone chart. But for now, we're just going to take only Deepcool Assassin 3 data and compare it against itself for a few one-off tests for validation of marketing specifically. And we have a lot of processes in place I need to cover first, but the one we're going to look at is the spoiler that Deepcool also marketed with similar ferocity to its composite heat pipes. Deepcool's plastic appendages on top of the dual tower heatsink are referred to as spoilers like on a car, and they claim that it lowers wind resistance and that it, quote, ensures every bit of air is utilized. So we ran some A/B benchmarks in a heavily controlled test environment to take a look at this. The most immediately relevant bit of information is that you can detach the spoilers with a set of, it's just Allen screws on the bottom here, so there's 3 for each side holding them in. It pulls off. You don't have to do anything destructive. You can put it back on or off as desired, and it is just a plastic piece that sits on top of the heat pipes. And then the fan bleeds a little bit over the edge at the top since it's a bit taller than the heatsink itself. Before we get into just 2 numbers, it's all we're going to show you for this one. It's probably worth going through some of the testing methodology. You're going to be seeing more of this as we publish more of our thermal data for things. So thermal tests are conducted on an R73800X with all the voltages controlled on the motherboard. AMD has a bit more accurate temperature reporting than Intel does right now. We monitor voltages throughout the test because that's what most heavily impacts the temperature. And we log them with a special sheet that alerts us to any deviation from the acceptable range that we've specified. So we're alerted. We don't even have to manually look, but we do that too. And for these one-off tests, we only did a fixed frequency of 4.3 gigahertz. We do that at 1.287 volts to get, and we set SOC to 1.063 volts. And that's a fixed voltage throughout the test for both of those. And remember that our goal here is to consume a reliable, known, consistent amount of power and nothing else. We're not trying to hit a high overclock. We're trying to produce heat, and it needs to be a regular amount of heat that is unchanging. So that's our only goal here, and that's what we've accomplished with these settings, along with some other changes we made on the software side of things. So other controls include, obviously, all the test components are the same every time. The motherboard's an MSI X570 Meg Ace, and it's the exact same unit all the time. It's dedicated for this test bench. We use the same individual CPU, RAM. We use a half-height GT1030 that's shoved into a lower slot, so you're not dealing with radiative heat off the backside of the GPU. It's pretty far away. And power output is monitored every millisecond to ensure that the load generating software doesn't deviate from the power that we expect to be required of the CPU to produce the thermal load. And then we also keep an eye on even just Blender or whatever software you're using to test from one run to the next. With software, you'll see a slightly different power load. So it's possible that from test A to test B, you'll see an average of 150 watts and 140 watts. You might have a 10-watt delta. We eliminate that. We've fine-tuned our specific test image that we use in Blender for this, and it produces the same amount of power every time, and we also check, and if it does deviate for some reason, then we rerun the test and trash the data that deviates from where it's supposed to be, because otherwise it's not accurate. That's something a lot of testers don't check for, is to make sure their software is actually trustworthy. Most of the time it does jump around a bit, and you have to know when to throw out the results. Next thing we look for is consistency between runs. So a lot of the time we'll run multiple passes with a cooler mounted one specific way and then remount it and double check that the data is about the same. Sometimes with a remount you might see some variance. That's where you typically see the most variance, is from mounting pressure. And so we rerun the test with multiple mounts to make sure that we've checked for that, and if anything deviates from the mean or from into a territory of becoming an outlier, then we get rid of that data and rerun it. All the tests are run multiple times for parity. The data is analyzed from steady state for the die temperature, and then we also monitor ambient every second to keep it fixed to 21 degrees Celsius, plus or minus about 1 degree. at Celsius, and we then take a delta of Tdi and ambient to account for the fluctuation in ambient when it exists, and fluctuation impact is pretty linear at this low of a variation. Some other specific stuff for this cooler to be tested properly: the fans have to be positioned precisely on the cooler. So the front and the middle fans have to be kept in the same spot, and it has to be the same fan too. If you have fan A in the front, fan B in the middle, you can't switch them when you're doing validation because the results will be different, because fan RPMs can vary by plus or minus 10%. So we tested with the same front and middle fan. We marked them for permanent use in the future, and we marked the cooler so that we know at what height the fans are installed. The front is higher for memory clearance, as you'd expect, and thermal paste is manually spread to ensure consistency. We use an Asetek factory paste that we obtained privately for all testing, as we know this to be consistent from batch to batch, unlike some retail pastes that can have variance from batch to batch. Fan speeds are controlled as well, of course. This is the most important thing. So for fan speeds, we don't have anything set to auto basically at all, but fan speeds especially are controlled. For these, we have the speeds at about 1340 RPM average for the second fan, 1329 for the first fan. That's the maximum speed for each one and is within variance, and that's 100% fan speed via PWM within BIOS. And then for this one-off test, just looking at the results here, the Deepcool Assassin 3 averaged 53.8 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient in its no spoiler configuration at 100% speed. And with the overclock, the result with the spoiler installed landed at 53.5 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient. This is within test variance run to run and should be considered equivalent. There's no difference between the results. The spoiler isn't actually helping. We also logged VRM MOS results, but those are irrelevant in this test given that the location of the spoiler is not anywhere close to them. So we won't bother making a chart for that, but they were all the same for the 3 VRM MOS thermal results we logged. As for how this compares to competitors like the NHC15, you'll need to check back for that. We have a lot of thermal testing that we need to come through more carefully for that discussion. This is just a spot check on a marketing claim for today. So in short, the Assassin 3's performance may be fine or even good. We need to look at the comparative data more still. But its performance is not it's not a result of the marketed reasons. They have nothing to do with it because one of them was a lie and the other one is just typical marketing BS. And the spoiler being marketing BS isn't really surprising. Experienced testers should be able to identify that without even doing A/B testing. You can look at the claims, you can look at the product, and for the most part go, no, don't think so. And that's pretty much all there is to it. There might be some kind of producible difference in extreme synthetic testing, but it's nothing meaningful at all. And we weren't able to see anything in real world testing that was heavily controlled. So anyway, the heat pipe thing, you'd have to cut them open to know it wasn't true. And most users are not going to do that because it's like $100 or something, and they're not going to cut it open. Most reviewers wouldn't do it either. And like we said, we wouldn't have cut this apart if Deepcool didn't make such a big fuss about it. But if they had maybe once mentioned the heat pipes were different, we'd probably just leave it alone. And then we might have looked at the performance and said, well, maybe it's doing well because of the heat pipes, or maybe it's not doing well because of the heat pipes. But cutting it open isn't necessarily something you jump to right away. So the biggest change here, performance remains the same for reviews that were accurate. Deepcool's credibility has become suspect because of these stunts. We'll be more closely scrutinizing their marketing in the future, especially at trade shows. We do that already, but we'll do some more now. And at a show, we can't really cut a heat pipe open as much as I'd like to, but we can bring this point back up repeatedly and make sure everyone's aware of what's going on. As a cooler, again, performance today is not different than yesterday, only emphasizing this because I know a lot of people have bought this, and it's true that the performance hasn't changed because of this information. I don't want a bunch of people to feel buyer's remorse when it's something they have no control over and something that doesn't actually change how it does for them. So this is one of those things where like outrage culture doesn't need to get blown out of proportion for this. It is bad that Deepcool was so extremely wrong about this. It's just fortunate for Deepcool that this situation didn't turn out worse and that the cooler is actually overall fine, because otherwise it'd be easier to make a big deal out of it because the performance might not have matched up so well. Anyway, they're compensating for the marketing lies by still delivering an overall acceptable product. Just be wary of Deepcool's marketing in the future. That's really the takeaway for this. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. You can help us out with the interesting reporting deep dives like this one by supporting us directly on patreon.com/gamersnexus, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one and one of our mod mats, which we have mediums in stock now and the large ones on back order. I'll see you all next time. This is just a spot check on a